Jim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. So, I'd like to present Jim Martin to the symposium. Jim he doesn't want too much of a talk up, so I'm not going to do the big announcement, but just to say that we're really grateful that Jim's agreed to this experiment, which we posed back in October, November. Was this possible? Could we do it? And it was a bit of a thought experiment at the time, which we were very interested to try. And James has been very instrumental in putting it together with Jim's team, the know-how and technical solution to this. So it is a bit of an experiment, but actually looks like it works. Fingers crossed, everybody. I've heard Jim speak. I know a number of people in the crowd have heard Jim speak. Paul Swift's waving furiously, which is always a bad sign at the back. So Paul's heard Jim Martin speak. It's a fascinating experience to listen to Jim, a gifted speaker and very well-respected scholar and leader in his field. And I did prepare everybody at the beginning that you need to keep some bandwidth clear for Jim's talk. So with that, I urge you to now focus your minds and concentrate. Sit down and strap in. I'd like to present Jim Martin to the symposium. Over to you, Jim.
All right. Thanks for that, Phil, and James. Thank you for putting the technology together, and thank you all for coming. So today we'll talk about some work from my lab and from others, in which we'll sort of explore this notion of what is myth and what is science in cycling. And is there an issue? All good? Okay. So before I get started on this, there will be some things that you may have held dear that turn out to be myths. And what I want to emphasize before I get started is that I'm a cyclist. I'm not just a lab-coated geek. I've been Texas State Champion. I've been Masters National Champion. I coached Masters World Champions. I am one of you. Okay, so don't make any moves to. Well, I guess you can't really come after me remotely, but so now let's talk about some of the science. So today again, myth and science in cycling, and three topics here. Crank length will be the first one, and Phil assured me that was of interest to you guys. Pedaling technique, and then we'll finish up with some work on non-round chain rings. The crank length and the pedaling technique are actually really well developed. The non-round chain rings are not as well fleshed out. Those studies are in progress, but they'll give you an idea where I think the data is going. So with regard to crank length, we'll talk about the effects on maximum cycling power, on metabolic cost of submaximal cycling or efficiency, and then we'll talk about how crank length influences pedaling biomechanics. And I'll start out with what I think, as cyclists, we might agree as three premises, or three cultural beliefs. There's an optimal crank length for each cyclist. The optimal crank length will substantially improve performance, whereas some non-optimal length will substantially compromise performance. And I think these are pretty well-held beliefs. At least they maybe not so much anymore. Maybe some of this is taking hold. And so if you Google optimal crank length, and I did this just a couple days ago, you get 170,000 hits. You get links to books, to magazines, to websites, YouTube videos. Here's a calculator where if you put in various parameters, it will tell you your optimal crank length. Here's a little sliding scale that you can use to figure out what crank length you ought to use. But what's the scientific evidence behind this? And so there are only really a few studies. An older study by Inbar, a modeling paper by Yoshihiko and Herzog, and then several papers out of my lab and Tom Korth's lab. And these are the ones that we'll focus on, and we'll try to figure out, is is crank length, can it be a magic wand to substantially improve performance? And one of the things that I need to convey about my lab is we use cycling as a model, but we don't actually study the sport of cycling. And that actually gives us quite a bit of freedom because we're not constrained by cultural norms. So when we study crank length, we don't look at 165, 167.5, 170, 172.5. We go from 120 to 220. And really it turns out that it's only by doing that we can actually get outside the noise and obtain meaningful results. So the purpose of this paper, so this is determinants of maximal power. It was in UAJAP, and our purposes were to determine the effects of crank length on maximum cycling power, simply, then optimal pedaling rate, and then optimal pedal speed. And in this case, what pedal speed means is the speed with which the pedal travels in a circle. And so that's a product of crank length and pedaling rate. And we wanted to determine the optimal crank length for maximum power based on leg length. So for this study, we brought in 16 trained cyclists. They performed maximal trials on 120, 145, 170, 195, and 220 millimeter cranks. We adjusted the seat height so that the distance from the saddle to the pedal in its most extended position was held constant. I specifically went out of my way to recruit tall and short cyclists. We measured thigh, tibia, and total leg length. We gave them practice sessions on each length before the testing, and then we measured the entire maximal power pedaling rate relationship. We use a technique called inertial load ergometry, and the beauty of that is that we get the entire power pedaling rate curve in one short maximal test. That way we know that we get maximum power as the apex. It's not just an artificial peak value. And we also get optimal pedaling rate, which gives you some information about fiber type distribution. So I'll just cut right to the results on this one. What you see here is just the maximum power averaged for a revolution, and in this data set, the extremes, the 120 and the 220, those are significantly different than these three lengths in the middle, 145, 170, 195. Those are not different from each other. And the difference between the highest and the lowest value is a little less than 4%. And I think this might come as a shocker because I believe that within cultural norms, cyclists would think that 120 millimeter cranks are comically short. You couldn't possibly produce any power on them, and 220s would be hopelessly long. But in fact, the effect on maximum power is pretty small, significant but small. And then if we go to this other range, so 145 to 195, which is probably, when I did this study, it was outside of the range that you could buy commercially. Now I guess you can buy a lot of different lengths. But still, this would be quite a huge range in cycling culture, and you're only seeing a 1.6% difference, and again, those differences are not significant. So the holy grail probably is to optimize crank length for an individual, and so I'm showing you average data, and you can say, well, that's because they were tall and short guys, and on average it doesn't matter as much as it really does for each individual. And so sure enough, when you scale leg length to crank length, and you use that as a variable down here, so this is total leg length to crank length ratio, and then you look at the variation in power on this axis, you get a significant relationship which accounts for about 20% of the variability. But what I want to call your attention to is that, so 100%, that means that's their best power on any of the lengths. And what I want you to notice is that each of my subjects reached his maximum value at different lengths. So you see this wide range of ratios up here representing 100%. And then the other thing to keep in mind is look at this scale. So I've scaled this from 90 to 100%. And if I change that scale to a zero base, well then you start to see that, well, how much does that crank length really influence power, or that crank length to leg length ratio? And the answer is that it accounts for 20%. So R squared of 0.2, statisticians in the audience will know that means that this variable is accounting for 20% of the overall variability. Well, that sounds good, but what